I am writing this on Father's Day 2025, and to mark this occasion, I will share my greatest parenting victory. Last spring, during Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, my daughter did all the things one does to try to get a ticket. She tried the presale, she pre-registered, she looked at the fan resale sites, she looked at the predatory reseller sites, she put alerts on all of her accounts, but no dice. The only tickets that were available were well out of our price range. And then, 2 days before the last concert in Los Angeles, a family friend found tickets we could barely afford and asked us if our daughter wanted to join. I sent a text message announcing that she had the tickets. It made me feel like a great parent and undoubtedly badly interrupted her AP English class. And so, with 48 hours to go, my daughter came home, disappeared into her room, and took to her homework like any good AP student would and announced that she needed to make sure that she had memorized every song that was on the Taylor Swift set list, plus every song that might be one of the 2 surprise songs that Swift added to each concert performance. If there was any song in any format that Taylor Swift had ever recorded, my daughter was going to make sure that she could sing along with it word for word at the concert. She came home and described the experience as a fever dream. Ms. Swift, if you are listening to this podcast, or more likely, the lectures I've uploaded to YouTube on advanced linear multiple regression heterogeneity tests, I just want you to know that you made my daughter's year. So, imagine my surprise when I was researching this episode, asked my daughter what she thought of Beautiful Ghosts. To my stunned amazement, she had never heard of it. Ever! Beautiful Ghosts is the original song that Taylor Swift recorded for the fraught and failed CGI animated version of Cats. How is it possible to make a show with a budget that large, with an all-star cast, including the single most popular entertainer on the face of the planet Earth, who can date whoever she wants, but should really be cheering for the Justin Herbert and San Diego Chargers? How can you take that and put together a production with every single bit of mass-marketed momentum going for it and end up with a flop? That is a more commercial and harder to untangle mystery than most that we've dealt with, but we'll be watching it from the cheap seats in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Okay, quick bookkeeping. This is the last episode in our 8-part series of Cats. The next production we'll take up will be Jesus Christ Superstar, because so far, what I've liked the most is starting with the books that originally inspired the musicals, and this time I get to start with the Bible. If it seemed like it was divine intervention that got the book Phantom of the Opera to the screen and the stage, what happens when you're talking about Jesus Christ Superstar? That's a whole new level, isn't it? Anyway, our next stop on this mutual journey to get new takes on old musicals will be Jesus Christ Superstar. But before that, we'll have a special episode that retraces the Phantom of the Opera a little bit. I've covered that one before and relied on a whole lot of written commentary to figure out what lessons that show has for theater and life. But I have found 5 very special fans of the show, and they shared what is, well, truly remarkable to me. As with most things on this show, I read the cosmic connections with a tongue-in-cheek and tasting them with a grain of salt. But if there was ever any doubt that it is all connected, these conversations make a stronger case than I had before. These are truly remarkable lives that are coming together on this production. So, brief retrace to the Phantom and then on to Jesus Christ Superstar. That is where we're going in the next couple episodes. Okay. There's definitely a temptation to pre-record this next bit, since I say about the same thing almost every time, but I'm keeping this live because the deep gratitude, I think, is something that can't be prepackaged, and I really do want you to know how much I appreciate you listening. Our conversations are always a little one-sided, but it means a lot to know that you're out there and that others find these different takes, deep dives, and repeated side quests as much fun as I do. The most important force that will make or break this show is you, and if you can post about this on social media, drop a link to an episode you think is worthwhile or that others might like, or leave a rating on the audio service that you use the most, that will have far more important and far-reaching consequences than you know. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, to set the academic context for today, academic fields spring up, splinter, and reform all the time. So an English department adds public speaking, and then it becomes communication, and then you add communication disorders and journalism. What you now have are 4 different subfields. Or you're studying human cultures, and you have anthropology, but then you start studying either evolutionary or cultural anthropology. Pretty soon you have people doing things different enough that maybe you need separate departments, different conferences, different journals, and eventually different fields. And if you're studying culture, well, then you can start with something called letters or humanities. And maybe then you need a department of languages, and then cultural studies, and then ethnic studies, and then gender studies. And you can only imagine what happens when you start studying art, where you might have studio art, visual art, performing art, and then you add critical studies to all those things. And you have areas like critical musicology or performance studies or critical performance studies. And amidst all this division, recomposition, and academic mitosis, there has emerged a field which I find absolutely fascinating, and it goes by the name failure studies. Today's featured scholar is Peter Kunze, Kunze, who is writing for The Velvet Light Trap. Okay? I'm going to take a deep breath. I think I can do all of this in one sentence. Peter Kunze holds a PhD in Media Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, a PhD in English from Florida State University, a Master's in English also at Florida State University, a BA in Communications from Rowan University, and a BA in English also from Rowan University. That is 5 different degrees, 2 of which are doctorates. Here is Peter Kunze's description of failure studies, quote, "What might be learned from studying unproduced media? In fact, must media be produced to be studied? In Theses on the Philosophy of History, Walter Benjamin observes, quote within a quote, if one asks with whom the adherents of historicism actually empathize, their answer is inevitable with the victor, end quote within the quote. By extension, history tends to focus on successes, especially when the story of such successes casts favor unto the victor. To this end, what histories are suppressed when we celebrate success, and who is silenced in the process? Furthermore, how might a focus on failed media reveal the realities of media production, where successes prove to be exceptional rather than normal, end quote. I could sidetrack myself for hours going off on these points, but let's reflect on this for a minute. Say the purpose of academic scholarship is to study some topic deeply, mostly for the sake of just understanding it more. Oftentimes that will have application, but not really the main thing that reason you're studying it. And now say that you're studying theater, where most scripts are never produced and most productions don't succeed by any commercial or popular measure. Sure, there's a lot to be gained by studying those that do succeed, but shouldn't we also study the far more common case of when a show fails? Kunze again, quote, the reality is that the media industries abound with failures. Jason Battelle, for example, argues that failure remains, quote, the default norm, unquote, thereby, quote, helping us to understand the limits of the system, end quote. Since failure represents the rule rather than the exception, it warrants more careful consideration in our growing study of media production. In addition to commercial or critical features, we need to study projects that never emerge from, quote, development hell, unquote, because attention to such failures may offer us more representative samples of industrial behavior and logics than a focus on successful media productions, end quote. And there was that quote within the quote. Kunze's quote overall, he's quoting Jason Battelle in the middle of that. In simpler terms, isn't it possible that we learn more from our failures than from our successes, like in life? So maybe it's worth studying what didn't work, and maybe it's worth looking at those things that we call failures because they were not commercial and popular successes and seeing if there's something of value in them. Okay, enough of that. I am here today to talk about 2 failures concerning transforming cats from a massively popular entertainment monolithic megalith, I'm pretty sure that's a word, into a successful film endeavor. And I did say 2. You've probably heard of the failed attempt at CGI cats that was released in 2019, but there is an even bigger failure before that. Against a field of massive failure, overall, theater teaches resilience if only because most who audition don't get the parts they want. Most shows that are written are never performed. Most of those performances don't go to Broadway, and most that do go to Broadway aren't hits. This first attempt had absolutely everything going for it and should have been a sure thing. But before we get to the thing that should have been a sure thing, and it was not, there was actually a very first attempt at something like this. Coons reports that none other than Walt Disney approached T.S. Eliot about producing an animated version of Cats. Eliot turned him down. He didn't want his mischievous cats to become too tame, is what Coons reports. All right, so the very first try is Walt Disney approaches T.S. Eliot. Eliot tells him no. And there the idea sat until on June 26, 1990, Universal Pictures announced that Steven Spielberg was pairing with Andrew Lloyd Webber to make an animated version of the musical. Just to recap Spielberg's body of work, I'm sure you've heard of him, but it's amazing just to read out loud. It includes Jaws, Jurassic Park, the Raiders of the Lost Ark franchise, Schindler's List, The Color Purple, Saving Private Ryan, Poltergeist, Back to the Future, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and E.T. And those were just mega hits. Other than that, he, of course, hasn't really done very much. No, there are hundreds of other things that he's done of various levels of success, but if there's one guy who gets Hollywood, it is Steven Spielberg. And, of course, we know Andrew Lloyd Webber. He did Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Cats, The Phantom of the Opera, and more recently, The School of Rock. A 2017 London Theatre article called him unstoppable. In fact, there are many since Cats who have called him critic-proof, and the Wikipedia article places him as the third wealthiest music artist in the world, just behind U2 and just in front of Coldplay. Wait, what? Coldplay? How'd that happen? But Paul McCarthy's number one, so at least that tracks. At any rate, he's not just one of the top musical theater people in the world. He's one of the wealthiest people in the entire entertainment industry. And at one point in 2017, he had 4 separate shows running on Broadway simultaneously. If there were 2 guys who knew how to make it in the entertainment world, who could make a production pretty much happen just by saying so, it was these 2 guys. So the production gets underway, and as Coons writes, quote, before Cats could be animated, it had to overcome one major difficulty, its plot or lack thereof, end quote. Coons points out that the show has no spoken dialogue, and here I'll quote again, quote, Cats has no discernible plot, but rather follows a concert-like format, end quote, although he later says, quote, plot was all but irrelevant, Cats was just an experience to be cherished, end quote. There's a little more to it than that. At least in theory, there's a jail cabal, and the cats are all making their pitch to become the chosen one for the Heaviside layer, but you're on pretty safe ground if you say the plot is a little thin. But to make it work on the break screen, it was going to need more than that. A guy named Tom Stoppard was hired to work on the screenplay. Then he found himself at odds with Trevor Nunn, who'd been the director of the musical. The plot had a little more to it. In Stoppard's work, McCavity and Grisabella had a failed fling, which is why Grisabella was an outcast. And then there's a kidnapping sequence where old Deuteronomy is taken hostage and then rescued. But it was all going so poorly that Stoppard didn't have a signed contract and refused to do more work until he got one. The early attempts at animation just confused the animators who were looking for how to characterize the different cats but couldn't figure out what the story was supposed to be about at its core. Spielberg wanted there to be lead characters and picked Mungo Jerry and Rumpelteazer, who he thought, and I'm quoting Coons, who's quoting Spielberg, quote, they embodied the movie's theme and microcosm, end quote. I don't know that I've heard anybody other than Spielberg say that. Coons thinks that there were also cultural differences where Spielberg communicated in a direct style that the Brits found abrasive, and Lloyd Webber and Nunn spoke in suggestions rather than demands. Spielberg was left wondering what they were really thinking, and Lloyd Webber wanted to know why Spielberg was being so rude. Moreover, in the words of Coons, quote, the failure of Cats partially results from the inability to negotiate the storytelling conventions and industrial cultures of Hollywood and the West End, end quote. So maybe you just make stories differently if you're doing theater in London than if you do them as a film in Hollywood. In 1995, Stoppard left the production under what Coons calls, quote, unclear circumstances, end quote. The production company, which had been founded for the film, called Amblimation. So the whole thing was done. By 1997, there wasn't even a company where people were working to try to complete it. In 1998, Andrew Lloyd Webber's production company, The Really Useful Group, produced a live action version performed on a closed stage in London. That resulted in a video that aired on PBS and was released directly to home video back when that was the thing that happened to major productions. That was also, for those of you who weren't around in the BC area, a little bit of an insult, like, how was your show? Well, it went straight to video. That meant it had not done very well. Koons has some take-home points. His main one is that too many cultural and industrial differences doomed this project. In the area of film, Spielberg was obviously the big dog, and the rest were going to have to produce a script that he'd sign off on. And when that didn't happen, the show is basically over. Koons also points to the strange notion of authorship, which T.S. Eliot really would have liked. The theory is that products of art are generally thought of as something that a single author creates, maybe a tight collaboration between a couple of authors. But Koons points out that for a modern Hollywood movie, so many people are making so many creative choices that it's almost impossible to say who the primary author is. Koons thinks that, ironically, by refusing to give Spielberg a script he liked, Stoppard was able to preserve his authorial agency. That is to say, he was able to stay true to his own artistic vision. Had he made a script that became a successful movie, he, of course, would have made piles of money, but he would have lost his central role as an artist. T.S. Eliot would have thought all that logic was great. Eliot was a strong believer that poets write poems, but they don't even really know where they come from themselves. And then once they go out into the world, the audience, as much as the author, decides what they mean and whether or not they're any good. So for Koons, failure studies might conclude that Stoppard's refusal to compromise on his script, resulting in the failure of the project, was actually a victory for preserving his artistic vision. For Koons, at least two main insights failure studies contributes are that cultural differences can lead to the failure of a movie even when all other factors point to success, a conclusion that sits very neatly with the field of intercultural communication, where I'm happy to say that my own Cal State Fullerton houses one of the best programs in the world. Anyway, first main point is that cultural factors can lead to the death of something that should be a success. The second main point that Koons takes away is that holding the line on artistic vision might result in the failure of the production, but also be an artistic success. If you're a music fan and you don't know who Captain Beefheart is, it's worth looking it up. It was considered one of the most influential albums of all time because a bunch of musicians listened to it, and it was a massive commercial failure. So was it a success or a failure? Failure studies, I think, would say if it's an artistic success, by God, it's a success. Okay, now we'll get back to some other reasons that the Lloyd Webber and Spielberg movie failed, but fail it did. No movie ever actually was made. Which gets us to failure number 2, the CGI Cats version that was released in 2019, which flopped. This also had a lot going for it. Toby Hooper directed it, and he'd done the 2012 Les Miserables movie, which did just fine. It had Judi Dench. If you'll rewind a couple of episodes, she was the original Grisabella way back in the early 1980s, but tore an Achilles tendon just weeks away from opening. She's gone on to do a bunch of really good stuff, tons of awards. And so this was a natural redemption for her of sorts. It also had James Corden, who seems endlessly affable and popular. It had Idris Elba, who's pretty good in almost everything. And by God, it had Taylor Swift. It was also produced by Universal Pictures, who apparently had committed to the idea that we needed a Cats show even after the Andrew Lloyd Webber Spielberg movie had flopped under their watch. That's a lot of Hollywood heft behind it. It grossed $75 million, but when you took away the costs, it had a net loss of $71 million. I am now going to read the Wikipedia page for the entry on this movie under the list of worst movies of all time. I just want to pause and say the single most defining, influential book of my life is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It is dreamed of by Douglas Adams in the early 1980s and almost perfectly predicts what the internet would be. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is an electronic book that has information about all kinds of things, but unlike a traditional encyclopedia that's just trying to give you accurate information, it tells you all the stuff you really want to know, even when that's not accurate. Sometimes it gets you much more information than you would get from an encyclopedia, which is way more useful, like not just the cultural history, but if you're looking for cheap drinks, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where you could find that. And when you look at the internet of the year 2025, it is almost exactly what Douglas Adams said would happen. Everything's apocryphal. It's weird. It's out there. Some of it's accurate. That's almost by accident. But what it's really good at is putting its finger on the pulse of cultural and popular opinion. So whatever the virtues or failings of Wikipedia is, I do think it is really great when you're trying to figure out what are the worst movies of all time. There's a list. It's on Wikipedia, and it starts by quoting Rolling Stone. Here's what it says, quote, "There are many, many other problems with Cats, but it was hard for anyone to focus on any of them when it just looked so crappy and disturbing. And they didn't use the word crappy. They used something more profane, end quote. Other critics also panned the performance and some of the actors, with James Corden and Rebel Wilson, who parodied themselves at the 92nd Academy Awards, receiving the most criticism. As of June 2024, Cats sits at 19% on Rotten Tomatoes. The film won 6 awards out of 9 nominations at the 40th Golden Raspberry Awards. That's an award that goes to the worst movies of the year, including Worst Director for Hooper, Worst Supporting Actress for Wilson, Worst Supporting Actor for Corden, and Worst Picture overall. The entry continues. Earlier reviews for Cats were embargoed. Mahola Dargis from the New York Times commented that, quote, a doctoral thesis could be written about how this mire spluttered into existence, end quote. The British newspaper The Daily Telegraph called the film a, quote, all-time disaster, end quote, with reviewer Tom Roby giving the film 0 stars in his review. Critics from the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and the Detroit News wrote that it was a candidate for the worst film of the 2010s, with the Detroit News reviewer Adam Graham writing, Cats is the biggest disaster of the decade and possibly thus far in the millennium. It's Battlefield Earth with whiskers, end quote, by Graham. Graham later selected Cats as the worst movie he had ever seen. Wade Major of Synagogues.com slammed it as, quote, showgirls with fur, end quote, while Battlefield Earth screenwriter J. David Shapiro, who previously won the Razzie for the worst screenplay, said Cats had usurped his film as the worst one ever made. Cats was included on Time Out's 40 best bad movies ever made list, end quote. The wiki article also has some quotes from Andrew Lloyd Webber, who also didn't like the movie and predictably perhaps blames it on a failure to take enough creative and performance input from those who made the musical launch and converted the musical into a success. Whew. Yes, nobody liked this movie. There are a couple of content notes that are worth mentioning. The movie did add the subplot where McCavity kidnaps Old Deuteronomy. It did get savaged by its critics, but its problems started even earlier than that. Kaylee Donaldson, writing for ScreenRant.com, wrote, quote, after the first trailer dropped during San Diego's Comic-Con, social media exploded with jokes, memes, and general questions as to what the hell just happened, end quote. As soon as the public got a chance to look at this movie, they had already decided they didn't like it. Zach DeLoach wrote a review of a Broadway revival of Cats for the Tribune network of news outlets, and in it, he proudly proclaims himself to be a lifelong fan and unabashed fanboy. He says that he proudly owned a copy of the 1998 film, that direct-to-home video that was the result of the Spielberg-Andrew Lloyd Webber failed collaboration, but he refers to the 2019 movie simply as a disaster. It gets one word in his article as a lifelong Cats fan. There is one author I found who valiantly defends that something in the show is of value, and it is Taylor Swift. Aja Romano, I've introduced before, but they are a 2019 fellow of the National Critics Institute, and they write in Vox. Now, Romano is fully aware of the overall quality of the movie, reporting that, quote, the new trailer that followed sent us into a grim, slow meltdown, unquote. But to Romano, Taylor Swift is the perfect lyrical partner to Andrew Lloyd Webber. Andrew Lloyd Webber needs good lyrical collaborators. In fact, most of his success has been with collaborators, and Taylor Swift is a good one. She loves the musical Cats. She loves actual Cats. She's a fangirl, and she knows how to deliver an emotional core to her songs. Cats very clearly resonates with the LGBTQ plus community, and that is Taylor Swift's sweet spot. For Grizabella, quote, with this one song, she goes from being opaque and silent to having depth, complexity, and a backstory that doesn't involve her being a sex object. End quote. Okay. That last bit relies on the idea that Grizabella is a prostitute, which Romano takes as read. But as was heavily discussed in our last episode, this is a misreading both of the original poems and the musical. But for Romano, the story does a lot more to develop the character than anything else in the production does. They're probably right about that. And it is also true that in the movie, it's probably more explicit that Grizabella is a prostitute, although that is also based on a misreading of the original text. The new song is sung by Victoria to Grizabella, and in the view of Romano, it gives a backstory that explains what the song Memory is all about. Grizabella was born into nothing, and now has beautiful memories of a fulfilling past and a strong sense that it has all been lost. Romano is a rare voice who doesn't like Memory, that song, all that much. At least as a plot point, they maintain that it doesn't sound like it's being sung by a cat, which is probably true, but maybe not more true than any other song that's in the show. Romano ants here. There's a little ellipsis in the middle I'm not going to say out loud, but, the full citation is in the notes. Quote, when Victoria has her epiphany that she's happy about her friends and she loves her alley cat life, she shifts from singing enviously to Grisabella about the beautiful ghosts of her memory. Instead, she sings, so I'll dance with these beautiful ghosts. OMG, you guys, the ghosts are the cats. The ghosts at the end of the song are cats. Victoria's ghosts are flesh and blood. And also, have you ever met a cat? Cats are clearly ghosts with their silent paws and their eerie glow eyes and their ability to vanish into thin air. Holy crap, she didn't say crap. She used a profane term. The ghosts are the cats. Only Taylor Swift could turn a metaphor about lost memories into a literal description of cats that is also a metaphor for found families and friendships. Don't argue with me. This is perfect. End quote. Romano will not be taking questions. And as I mentioned, she also used a stronger word than crap. I will just say that be all of that as it may, it did not land in my household and with my daughter. And I think that's just about a definitive yardstick as you're likely to get. I guess we can give Tom Stoppard 1 style point for artist integrity by refusing to produce a script that Spielberg wanted, and we give Taylor Swift 1 style point for putting a good song in a bad movie. I don't know that there's too much more that it can be said in favor of this show. Which gets us to the very end. Why did these 2 movies that should have had everything going for them, if nothing else, turn into bland successes like, I don't know, Star Wars, The Phantom Menace? I think it comes down to 2 things. First, as we explored a couple of episodes back, the thing that makes the stage production work is sex and spectacle. Neither of those 2 were present in the CGI version. The cats do move in ways that are, I guess, kind of suggestive, and there is, by some accounts, open prostitution of some have called Taylor Swift's Bumble Arena a seductress, but there's little doubt that the CGI treatment made it all a little less sexy and maybe creepy. Anyway, the stage production isn't really about sex per se, and T.S. Eliot's poems sure weren't. He could barely write about human sex in any way that wasn't an anxiety-ridden gross out, but it was definitely made sexy by the movement of the actors, and that was a factor in the stage production success. Now, I don't have a better way of saying this other than that in the stage production, the cats seem to have a kind of animal-like raw sexual energy. And if as an audience member, you're able to fully suspend your disbelief and start seeing the characters as cats in humanoid shape, moving as felines do, it's kind of sexy. And watching film-based CGI versions, even if Taylor Swift definitely does not have that effect, it's just weird, as Tim Waltz might say. And second, the film just doesn't have the spectacle. The show is frequently referred to as a rock concert. A rock concert doesn't need a plot. And a rock concert film succeeds if it captures some of the energy of the live performance. It never captures all of it, but you can't add a plot to it. They all have the same. There's a huge audience and backstage anticipation, and then the show explodes with wild energy, and then there's an afterglow. But the characters never develop more than, wow, that Jimmy Page guy really can't play a guitar, huh? That's just the nature of trying to take something like a rock concert and put it on film. And it's really, really hard to do that with a musical. And even the best film treatments of good shows are a faithful but less powerful documentation of what happened in the performance. Cats is a variety show. What is the best movie adaptation of a variety show that you've ever seen? Like, a variety show can be 30 minutes of light entertainment, but it can't be a feature-length 2-hour film. So for a movie to work, whether you are Tobe Hooper, Steven Spielberg, or Andrew Lloyd Webber, you need a plot, like a real plot where characters make choices with consequences, action develops, and something is changed. That's a lot more than having Taylor Swift add a better backstory to a key song, or slapping a kidnapping sequence on a character who's otherwise just one of many characters. A rock show doesn't need a plot. A musical can grab that rock energy with its live performance, but a movie only gets its energy from the plot. I will say that during COVID, I watched as many of the Fast and Furious movies as I could. I thought that there were 9, the internet insisted there were 14, and I'd watch them with the sound off as a thought experiment to see how well I could follow the plot without knowing any of the dialogue. The answer that I came up with was almost all of it, which is not surprising since, because with apologies to Vin Diesel, these are action flicks that don't have a lot to them once you take away the car scenes and the car chases. I also discovered that an amazing amount of all the movies is just stock footage of someone's hand shifting a gear or their foot stamping on a gas pedal. You don't notice that so much if there's sound, but boy, if there's not, you notice that. Here's the thing. If you took all those action sequences, even the best of them, and randomly ordered them into a 90-minute show, it would be awful. Even those with no deep connection to narrative plot development but love to see fast cars and underdressed women would not pay to watch it. A movie can't just be action sequences. You gotta have a plot. Characters need motivation. You can't, as T.S. Eliot successfully did, just introduce 9 different characters and leave it at that. And remember, as we discussed in past episodes, for Andrew Lloyd Webber to get the rights to Cats, he had to promise to stay true to the original Eliot poems. And it was T.S. Eliot who very posthumously won the 1982 Tony for the best book for the production of Cats. He has the credit for having conceived of the entire show, because it was all based on his work. To make Cats work as a movie, you need to build a plot from the ground up, and you probably can't do that and be true to the musical, which had to be true to the original poems. Maybe the failure was inevitable, and there was nothing that even Steven Spielberg could do that could make that work. So, what have we learned about theater and life after these 8 missives into Cats? The main thing, I think, is that there is power to the visceral experience of live theater. It might not be the cool new AI thing. It might not be the most lucrative thing. It might not be the next thing, but it is a deep and powerful thing, and it can't be replicated in other media. Live music will always have something that recorded music does not, and live theater will always have something that video doesn't. And of course, the reverse are true. It's always possible for a live show to totally botch a good musical recording, and there are bad concerts out there. But the important thing is that they are different. And that means something in our AI-driven age where it's possible to communicate with a personal chatbot, to have the AI generate and read an entire podcast, to write an entire movie script, to generate all the advertising that you're going to see, and to play virtual reality video games. Given all that, it's nice to know that what makes a good party is still people hanging around and talking to each other face to face. And what makes a good concert is still a great live performance. And what makes a good night at the theater is still a great live performance by talented performers. In 24-25, 14.7 million people saw a Broadway show. And that's a complete recovery since the pre-pandemic high of 14.77 million in 2018 and 2019. The audience grew in size every year between 2002 and 2018, and it's increased every year since 2021-22. The average number of people seeing a show per running week has increased every decade since 1980 and every year since the pandemic. In 24-25, 5,563 people watched a Broadway show for each playing week, the highest in any recorded year since 1980. The audience for live theater is growing. It is not shrinking. All of this comes from the BroadwayLeague.com research statistics site. It might not be as big as a huge Hollywood blockbuster in terms of the number of people who see it, but Broadway is growing, not shrinking. That to me proves that there is something to live theater and it's not going away. The second lesson is that there are lots of parts of theater, including lighting, staging, directing, sets, performances, musical playing, composing. When we covered Phantom of the Opera, what really made that show work in the silent film era was Lon Chaney Sr. His performance as the Phantom, and even more than that, his gravitas on the set was what created the final product. I don't think there's Phantom the musical without Phantom that silent movie, and Lon Chaney and what he did really made that work. For Cats, I think the real hero is director Trevor Nunn, and maybe just by a nose in front of choreographer Gillian Lynn. In a show without a plot, that succeeds because it creates a totally immersive world where anthropomorphized cats is kind of really the only point. Nunn and Lynn were able to give the performers a way of moving and interacting to develop relationships and give a sense of actuality to a whimsical fantasy world. John Napier's sets did something similar. If this were a race, it would be Nunn by a nose, Lynn slightly behind Napier, maybe in third with hair behind Gillian Lynn. So I think the second main lesson from Cats is that it takes all the different roles to make musical theater work, and the importance of each component of that will vary in the production. For Cats, I think it was the sets, the movement, and the direction that really made this production work. And a final note. Earlier, I said that Taylor Swift should be cheering for the San Diego Chargers. Yes, the San Diego Chargers. The ownership group can sell out and take them wherever they think they can get the most money. But since I was 10 years old and knew nothing about football, other than the lightning bolt on the helmet was the coolest design in the National Football League, they have been the San Diego Chargers to me. And in my heart, they always will be. If Cats can make it seem real that there's an entire cat society out there singing and dancing, I can suspend my disbelief long enough to believe that Justin Herbert still plays in San Diego. Taylor Swift, you want to date somebody who's playing for the Kansas City Chiefs? I'm not going to tell you that your heart is pulling you in the wrong direction, but if you stay a football fan, check out the San Diego Chargers. That will do it for this rendition of the show. Up next, we'll have the first audience-inspired attempt to interpret a great production. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the podcast episodes that deviate from form to go into the Ask Me Anything segments or guest conversations. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just not my cup of tea. But I can promise you that our departure is going to be nothing like that. You are going to hear about 5 fascinating lives and how they all intersect around one musical production. We know how he can kill you, but we will find out how the Phantom of the Opera can save your life in the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.